Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the show. On today's episode of the show, I'm sitting down with Stephen Del Duca, former member of the Provincial Parliament of Ontario, and now the current leader of the Liberal Party of Ontario. He served in that position since March the 7th of 2020, just over a year. He previously served as the Ontario Minister of Transportation, as well as the Minister of Economic Growth and Development in the cabinet of former Ontario Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne.
Making Orono great again. Tell your neighbors, tell all your friends. It's the answers you need to know. It's the Wyatt Sharp Show.
Welcome to the show. Today, the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, Stephen Del Duca, is joining me. Hello, Stephen, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Wyatt. I'm looking forward to it.
So my first question is, why did you get involved in politics, and why did you want to run for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party?
So I was fairly young when I got involved in politics the very first time. I was only 14 years old. I was invited to a meeting by a family member. Turned out it was a candidate nomination meeting at the federal level all the way back in 1988, so 33 years ago for me. And I got invited to that meeting mostly because my cousin needed someone, a young guy at the time, to help put out chairs and sort of corral volunteers. And I like to call it for reasons related to unskilled labor at the time. And that's why I got into politics, but I've remained active in Liberal Party politics provincially and federally now for more than 3 decades, because I really believe in the ability of political parties, when they're working towards a positive goal, to really make life better for people. The vehicle that I've chosen, of course, is the Liberal Party because of my outlook on life, my philosophy specifically. And I chose to run for the leadership of the party after I'd lost my seat in 2018, which was a tough election for Ontario Liberals, because my wife and I are raising two young daughters. Our older daughter is 13, our younger daughter is 8. And I really felt and still feel like the kind of opportunity that I had growing up here in this province is at risk for them as they grow up and for other kids like them. And I don't like that. And I didn't think that was good enough. So I threw my hat into the ring. I was successful in the leadership, and now I'm leading the party and working really hard to be ready for the election next year.
Yeah, no, for sure. So my next question for you today, Stephen, is what do you think, when looking at the PC government's response to COVID-19, what is kind of the biggest thing that if an Ontario Liberal Party was in government, that they would have done differently?
So I think it's really fair to say, regardless of partisan stripe, so Conservative, Liberal, NDP, depending on where you are in the province or the country, that at the very beginning of the pandemic about a year ago, governments of all partisan stripes and all levels were really scrambling to deal with something that was incredibly disruptive and unprecedented. So in those first few weeks, I don't really quarrel or take issue with very much that Doug Ford's PC government did, because they were scrambling like the federal government and other provincial governments. It's more when you get into the summer months, when the case count started to come down, and looking closely at how Doug Ford didn't prepare adequately for the reopening of schools, how there weren't proper protections for nursing homes and the seniors living there, how small businesses were really left to their own devices, and so many of them have been badly crushed by the pandemic and the lockdowns, that I really have been very concerned about Doug Ford's ability to convey a clear, consistent, and not confusing message to the people of Ontario. And so, look, I think when it comes down to it, the biggest challenge Doug Ford has had, where I think a Liberal government would have been different, is that I don't think fundamentally Doug Ford believes in the power of government to do the right thing under really tough circumstances. When you don't believe in government, it's really hard to actually then utilize the tools of government, especially during a crisis. So I happen to think, and I have lots of friends who are conservatives and lots of friends who are New Democrats. I do believe that, especially in a moment of crisis, you have to have some faith in government to get things done in order to lead effectively. And I just don't think Doug Ford, frankly, has that view of government or has the competence to do the right thing in this regard.
Yeah, no, for sure. So my next question is, what is your opinion on the people of Ontario going back to work? People say that the PC government is opening up the province too quickly. But there are a lot of people who are ready to get back to work. An example of that would be small business owners who want to reopen their doors again. So, what is yours and the Ontario Liberal Party's view on reopening the province, and how long over the span of time would it take?
So it's a really tough question to answer because different parts of the province, different regions of the province obviously have had different case counts, different numbers of positives and challenges. So places like Toronto, Peel, my home region of York region, the area around Ottawa and the Hamilton area really have struggled. Right now, Thunder Bay up in the north is experiencing some really scary numbers. So look, I think the best thing that any political leader could be doing would be listening to the very best advice from medical experts and scientists. We've seen in the last couple of days people who are on the government's science table, the people who have expertise in this area, are very concerned about the third wave that we are now officially in, and how the so-called variants of concern are actually spiking the numbers again. Up against that, trying to balance how small business owners can stay afloat because it's been so tough for them. To me, the bottom line, Wyatt, is that this is a public health crisis. And so, in order to actually get our economy reopened successfully, not just for a few weeks, but like get it open, keep it open, let people go back to work, let small business owners thrive, the best way to do that is to crush the virus. So, the biggest challenge I think we've had since September of last year is the lockdown, reopening. The back and forth has really made life brutal for people's mental health, for kids in classrooms, for frontline education workers, and for small business owners. I would have much preferred stronger, more decisive action at the front end last October, November, instead of kind of dithering or delaying for day after day after day. Crush the virus completely, like places like New Zealand and Australia have done, and then reopen, stay open, and let the economy thrive. And that's what I would like to see going forward.
You mentioned at the beginning about how some of the more uh, COVID, the regions that have a lot of COVID, and that their COVID rates are up high. So, would you support a regional approach as well? Is that the view of the Ontario Liberal Party?
Yeah, for sure. I think going the regional approach, I said this as early as last summer, going on a regional approach made a lot of sense to me. When I look at things, however, like the vaccine rollout, I think it took too long for Doug Ford to delegate the authority for the plans out to the public health units. So I would have much preferred that he or his vaccine table, if they had said that in November, December, I think that would have been a lot more clear. We all knew, especially in December, that vaccines were likely to be coming in the new year, in the year that we're in now. And I think if Doug Ford or his team had said back in late December, look, we're going to actually flow this out to the 34 public health units across Ontario, it would have given those units a month and a half to prepare. But the fact that it took until February for Doug Ford to use that regional approach and delegate out to the public health units, to me, again, was an unnecessary delay that I think has caused more confusion than was necessary.
Yeah, no, for sure. So my next question that I have for you today is, what would you say to someone that doesn't think implementing paid sick days is realistic, and that they're skeptical in terms of not knowing where the money would come from?
So the paid sick leave that we still are calling for is pandemic specific, because we know how much of a public health crisis this is. And this is not simply coming from me as a politician or other politicians. There are public health leaders in Toronto, Peel, York, and elsewhere who have said consistently since last fall that we still have thousands of workers, many of whom are employed in essential industries, who've repeatedly been going to work when they have COVID symptoms. Perhaps some of them, many of them have COVID. They're doing that because the alternative is to stay home without a paid sick benefit, meaning that they're going to put themselves and their families at risk. So they choose to go to work while sick, which then has the, I guess, the byproduct of making more people sicker, spreading the virus, lengthening the lockdown, and actually hurting the economy. So to me, it's about investing on the front end in a program. I still recommend that Doug Ford has had the resources available in order to make the investment to create a pandemic specific 10-day provincial government paid sick program. We know from the Financial Accountability Officer here in Ontario that up until December last year, the government was still sitting on close to $6 billion in unspent pandemic relief. I think that's money, for example, that could have been used to help subsidize a pandemic related 10 paid sick day program in particular in hotspots like Peel, Toronto, York, and elsewhere. So we could crush the virus and get back to a really prosperous economy. Instead, sadly, Doug Ford has very stubbornly chose to say, no, this is not something we should be doing. The federal government's already got a program in place, but I don't think the federal government's program, as good as it might be, is actually sufficient for the kind of crisis that we're in right now.
Yeah, no, no, for sure. So my next question is, what should be done to stop the big political divides that we are facing right now, and unite liberals, conservatives, NDP, Green, whatever party you belong to, make sure that we can all unify as Ontarians?
That's a really interesting question. I've watched, as I said in my first answer to you today, Wyatt, how through more than 3 decades, there's always been fairly excessive partisanship in our political system. It's part of what historically makes our system kind of run. And I've grown up in that system. So I completely understand the adversarial approach that we've always used in our politics. I think it's really important on some of the critically significant issues, dealing with this pandemic, fighting climate change, looking at income inequality and creating economic dignity. I agree. I think it would be far better if we could stress what unites us rather than divides us. I don't think it's an easy answer. I will tell you that I think tackling income inequality is one of the single most important issues that governments in the Western world should be looking at, because I think in places where you continue to see the 1% or less than the 1%, the ultra rich. I'm not talking about middle class families. I'm talking about the ultra rich continue to do better and better and better, and more people who are working harder. The traditional middle class, for example, that I grew up in, despite the hard work, falling further and further behind, actually over time breeds a lot of resentment. That resentment then feeds into political divides, that feeds into political polarization, which helps to rip apart a society. We've seen it south of the border. We've seen it in other parts of the world. Canada and Ontario are not immune to that kind of polarization. So as a liberal, as a moderate, pragmatic, traditional liberal, I believe it's far more important for us to stress what does unite us, not what divides us. Create an economy where hardworking middle-class families can actually succeed. And if government does that, I think there's a lot greater chance of success in terms of stopping that polarization and those divides that I don't like at all, that I'm not comfortable with at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my next question is, we know that Doug Ford and the PC government want to get rid of the carbon tax, and they say that they want to get rid of it to get rid of this tax to make life more affordable. Do they have a point in saying this? Because obviously liberals do support the carbon tax. So does the PC government have a point in saying this?
Well, no, I fundamentally disagree with Doug Ford's approach to fighting climate change. In fact, Doug Ford doesn't have a plan for tackling climate change here in Ontario. So, when he was first elected nearly 3 years ago, one of the first things that he did was eliminate the program that Ontario Liberals had put in place, which put a price on carbon pollution in Ontario. Doug Ford got rid of that shortly after becoming premier. It's now been almost 3 years, and he's not put in place any kind of alternative program to help Ontarians do their part to fight climate change. And I think that's wrong. So, he might not have agreed with cap and trade or a carbon tax, but he's not actually put in place any kind of Ontario conservative alternative that actually helps us deal with climate change, which is a really huge threat for our collective future. In fact, instead of doing the right thing and figuring out a different way, in his own view, perhaps a better way, I would disagree, but still a better way of dealing with it, he instead has taken hard-earned tax dollars and forced gas station owners to put stickers at their pumps fighting the federal government's price on carbon pollution. He's paid for lawyers to take the federal government to court over this. He's paid for radio and television commercials months ago fighting all of this. I think fundamentally, which is really scary for me, I'm not convinced that Doug Ford believes climate change is real. I don't think that he believes the science on this. And I think he's trying to take political advantage of fighting the science of climate change, which is a real shame. And it's also an economic opportunity lost. South of the border now, the new president of the United States, Joe Biden, he and his team have now developed a massive plan. I'm talking trillions of dollars to shift the US economy to what's known as a low carbon economy. The economies of Ontario and the United States, in particular in areas like auto, which I know is important to Durham region and important to Oshawa with the General Motors plant that thankfully is going to be restarting out in the Oshawa area, to look at the supply chain and the economies that we have and how they're interlinked. If Ontario is not participating in that shift to a low carbon economy, we're going to miss out on jobs. So to me, Doug Ford's approach on climate change is bad on the social front, it's bad on the environmental front, but it's also really, really backwards economic policy. And it's ultimately going to kill jobs in this province. So it's like strike one, strike two, strike three. I hope Doug Ford realizes the missed opportunity that he's got, wakes up and does the right thing. But for now, nearly 3 years, he has refused to move in this area.
Okay, so my next question is still on the topic of the environment and climate change. So my apologies. Joe Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, and then now Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan is thinking about canceling Enbridge Line 5. Doug Ford and the PCs obviously want these two projects to go ahead. What is the Ontario Liberal Party's view on these projects going ahead or not going ahead?
Well, I would say on Keystone, first of all, I understand the concern. There's obviously a lot of really good paying jobs in the construction industry and elsewhere that something like the Keystone pipeline would have potentially supported, including a lot of infrastructure and construction jobs based here in Ontario that could have helped with some of the supply chain that would have been, again, positively impacted by Keystone. Here's the thing though, Wyatt. The cancellation of Keystone should not have caught anybody off guard because Joe Biden campaigned on it. It's not like he kept it secret. For months throughout his campaign, he said to the people of the United States, and frankly, the people watching around the world, including in Canada, if I become president, I'm going to be canceling Keystone. This goes back to my point of a couple of minutes ago. When Doug Ford refuses to accept the science on climate change, I think he's hurting the environment that you're going to inherit, that my daughters are going to inherit, which is very scary. But I think he's also missing out on an economic opportunity. And so sticking your head in the sand and pretending that somehow a Keystone pipeline is going to save Ontario jobs isn't looking at the whole picture. So again, I think it would have been far more responsible for Doug Ford to have realized months ago, look, if Biden wins, he's going to cancel this pipeline. What can I do to position Ontario to create lots of really good middle-class jobs that have great pay and good workplace benefits? Maybe they're unionized, maybe they're not, but at the end of the day, they support hardworking Ontario families by tapping into that low carbon economy. Maybe it's reinstating electric vehicle subsidies. Maybe it's looking at the mining sector in Northern Ontario, where we have cobalt and nickel, which are two essential ingredients that go into lithium-ion batteries that power the cars of the future. Anything like that would have made a lot of sense to me. What Doug Ford did in the alternative, stick his head in the sand and pretend it was all going to be okay, is not the kind of leadership that I want to see. On Line 5, I get where the governor of Michigan is coming from, because I know there's an environmental concern about Line 5, but there is way too much in southern and southwestern Ontario in particular around our farming community, how families in that part of Ontario heat their homes, how they survive, the jobs that come along with that production. I am in the process of writing, or have already written, a letter to Prime Minister Trudeau asking him to stand up in support of Line 5, while Enbridge and others in the industry can look at alternatives that will meet what the governor of Michigan wants to accomplish. But I believe Line 5 for the time being needs to remain open. It would be a catastrophic blow to Ontario's economy and the quality of life, particularly in southwestern Ontario, if that line were to close.
For sure, yeah, no, so that was my final question. So again, thank you very much for joining me today, and it's been a real privilege and honor to chat with you.
My pleasure, Wyatt. Great meeting you, and I hope you and your family stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, you as well.
Take care.